Good afternoon and welcome to our live coverage of the SNP Spring Conference in Inverness. Very shortly, delegates will hear from the party leader and First Minister Alex Salmond. The talk of the steamy, of course, is this week's announcement of the date of the referendum. Plenty more on that to come. This is the scene in the conference hall where delegates are debating ahead of the First Minister's address. Well, I'm joined in the studio by Professor John Curtis of Strathclyde University, and our political editor Brian Taylor is in Inverness for us. We'll be getting their thoughts in the course of the afternoon. But first, the path to Inverness may have been bedeviled by snow, but the road to the referendum is clear now we have that date, September the 18th, 2014. From Inverness, here's our political correspondent, Raymond Buchanan.
There's quite a selection here at Inverness's Eden Court Theatre. Music, dance, drama. But in the world of Scottish politics, there's only one show in town.
Congratulations on being the 25,000th member.
Alex Salmond arrived in Inverness fresh from naming the date of the independence referendum.
Because they all want one now, you see. Everybody wants a special.
Over the weekend, he'll be joined by more of the party faithful as they gather in the Highland capital.
But the next 18 months is about the why of independence. Why should Scotland become an independent country? And that's where we'll be laying out the platform at this conference and over the next 18 months. So it's a hugely exciting thing. It's a hugely positive thing. It's an energising thing. And I expect you'll see that over this weekend and for the next 18 months.
Inside the Eden Court Theatre, Alex Salmond will be preaching to the converted. But their yes votes are already in the bag. The real challenge for the SNP is convincing sceptical voters out there in the real world. And they hope to do that by arguing Scotland will be more prosperous and fairer if it opts for independence.
This is going to be the most exciting time in Scotland's history, with one of our most important choices, and it's by speaking to people directly in the biggest campaign in Scottish political history that will secure the yes vote.
This is a party setting itself up for a great political battle. It may not be glamorous, but it will be dramatic, whatever the result.
Well, Professor Curtis and Brian Taylor are with me just now. Good afternoon, Brian. Thanks very much for joining me from Inverness. So we're talking about the talk of the steamy. There was one tweet from one journalist I saw from Inverness saying there was some criticism of the Yes Scotland campaign so far. What's the kind of general mood amongst the delegates, particularly with that all-important date being announced?
The mood is exceptionally upbeat, but then you wouldn't expect anything else. I think that they're doing several things here at conference, doing them simultaneously. On the one hand, they are trying to suggest independence is part of a continuum from devolution, and so in that regard there will be praise for efforts by the existing Scottish Government, but also references back to free personal care and the smoking ban, etc., caused by previous administrations, the idea being to try and suggest that you move from these lowlands, if you like, to the uplands of independence. At the same time, there will be attacks upon measures, particularly by the Westminster Government, but also by Labour in Scotland. So they try to say the sort of things that Scotland could dispense with if independence is created, and welfare featuring very, very strongly in that regard. So you'll hear Alex Salmond saying, this is what we could do with independence, but we could do without. For example, the so-called bedroom tax, and he'll also criticise Labour in there with questioning of universality. Indeed, we had a topical motion on that just a short time ago. But there's a third element to that as well, and that is hard practical preparation for the referendum campaign. Angus Robertson is on right now talking about that subject. We'll hear from him later in the programme, but he's talking about the preparations that need to be made on the ground with activists, getting the leaflets right, getting the register increased, getting turnout assessed, etc. So I think that's the elements we'll see at this conference. Professor Curtis, who will Mr Salmond be addressing, do you think? The delegates in the hall or the folk out there watching this?
Well, that's certainly an interesting question. It's what we've heard so far in terms of the kinds of things that Mr Salmond's going to say, which Brian's given us some indication of. It sounds to me rather more like the kind of speech that's going to appeal to the folk in the hall rather than necessarily one that's outside. I mean, there is no doubt that inside the SNP, things like not wanting Trident and therefore wanting independence for that reason, wanting to have a fairer society, these are important motivations why many people inside the SNP want Scotland to become an independent country. Go outside that hall, however, and those links and that mood is not necessarily so obvious or so pervasive. So, for example, such polling evidence as we have suggests Scotland probably is rather more against Trident than in favour, but still there may be around almost a half of the people who are in favour of independence are not necessarily against Trident. And certainly when you look at attitudes towards welfare, well, two things to say. The first is that actually only around 1 in 5 people in Scotland at the moment think that Scotland would be a fairer society. There'd be a smaller gap between rich and poor if Scotland became independent. And there are even fewer people at the moment who think that Scotland would be a fairer society than would be a prosperous one. So to that extent, at least, it's pretty clear there's quite a lot of work for the SNP to do if those kind of messages that appeal to SNP activists will necessarily work amongst the outside public.
And Brian, a few of those points came up when you spoke to Nicola Sturgeon, didn't they?
They did, Andrew. I'll tell you what I was really struck by in doing the webcast interview this morning with Nicola Sturgeon. I've done umpteen of these at various party conferences, and the questions are generally generic, either supportive or attacking. But the questions that were posed by our viewers and listeners and readers this morning were very precise, many of them very, very precise, expressing anxieties about very, very precise potential details of independence. I picked up on quite a few of those and started by asking Nicola Sturgeon what would be the fallback if their plan to adopt Stirling as part of a Stirling zone were not to be accepted.
Remaining within Stirling is our choice, it's our preference, and that's what we're going to argue for, and it's what we're going to deliver if it's the SNP that's in government for
But if
Scotland.
the Bank of England says no or sets impossible terms?
Why on earth would the
Well, why
Bank of
not?
England... Well, because...
Badness.
Well, but this is the
Exasperation
kind of myth
at
at the
independence.
heart of this debate.
But you can't
Why on
say the
earth?
alternative.
Well, if the Treasury was to decide that it no longer wanted Scotland's oil and gas exports or Scotland's whisky exports or our food and drink, other food and drink exports to count in the UK balance of payments, as they would do if we remained in Sterling, then that would be a pretty odd decision for a Treasury to take, and it would be a decision that was completely counter to the interest of the people they are supposed to serve. We've got to apply a bit of common sense to these debates, and this argument that's put forward by some of our opponents, England wouldn't let you. Well, sterling's as much Scotland's currency as it is the currency of the rest of the UK. The Bank of England just happens to be called the Bank of England, but I think it was founded by a Scot actually.
Indeed, yeah.
But it covers
do you
the
have
whole
a plan
of the
B?
UK.
If the sterling deal is a stinker, do you have a plan B?
I don't believe that will be the case, and why should we plan for something we don't think is in the best interest of Scotland? We've just had
sensible planning would be one answer.
We've just had a group of eminent economists, Nobel Prize winners amongst them, looking at this through the Fiscal Commission Working Group, and they set out in some incredible detail not just why remaining in sterling would be right for Scotland, but how that arrangement could work. Now,
yeah, but not one of them is in the Treasury or on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. They don't actually speak for those who would wield the levers of power.
We come back to the point I made earlier on. I will go down, Alex Salmond, John Swinney will go down and speak to the Bank of England about this next week if they want. We'll speak to the Treasury about this. Let's have this sensible discussion now. We are perfectly happy to do that. So, the opposition, the No campaign, cannot have it both ways. They cannot on the one hand say, tell us now what agreements you've come to with the UK government about all these things, and then on the other hand say, but as the UK government, we're not even going to have that discussion. So we're up for the discussion. Let's have it.
Your favourite is Stirling, as part of a Stirling zone. Is the second favourite option use Stirling unilaterally without agreement with the UK?
Well, the Fiscal Commission laid out the options that would be there for an independent Scotland.
That would be feasible. You could do that.
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is the Fiscal Commission laid out the different, I think it was the 4 different currency options that would be there. So those options are there for anybody to see in the 200 and odd pages that the Fiscal Commission produced. We're saying, and I think we're quite entitled to say it, that our strong preference is to remain within a sterling monetary zone. Now,
in order, they might be sterling zone, sterling unilaterally, euro, separate Scottish currency. Those are the 4 options.
The Fiscal Commission laid out those options as to what the options would be. I'm telling you what the preference of the Scottish Government is, and that is our preference because we believe it would be in the best interest of Scotland, that monetary price stability, but with independence, having the fiscal autonomy that allows you to get your economy growing. And it would also be in the best interest of the rest of the UK. And anybody from a UK perspective that credibly argues that that's not in the best interest of the UK. In fact, I think Alistair Darling, and he'll forgive me if I'm misquoting him here, but I think he said that where were Scotland to become independent, it would be desirable to stay within a Stirling zone.
So we keep a Stirling zone, we have the whisky and all the other experts part of the UK balance of payments, we keep the Queen, we maintain membership of the European Union. What's the purpose of independence in the first place?
Well, because you get tax powers, you get the ability to use your fiscal powers to target growth sectors or growth companies. You could do something about air passenger duty that is stifling our airports and our economic potential around tourism just now. You can use your fiscal powers. That's where, and that's, the Fiscal Commission laid this out in great detail. That's the benefit of independence. These are the powers that allow you to create jobs. These are the powers that allow you to grow the economy, put more money into people's pockets. That's the point of independence. And if you asked anybody else in any other country what the point of independence was, they'd look at you askance, because other countries that are independent know all too well what the benefit of that independence is.
Still on the economy, John Rowland, thanks for your question, John. In all honesty, can you tell him his income tax will not go up if Scotland gets independence? He's very suspicious.
Well, Scotland will be a democracy, okay, and there will be elections. Now, in 2016, as we discussed a wee while ago, Labour might win the election. Now, from this vantage point, it might seem unlikely that that is the case, but they could. I can't tell you what Labour's policy on income tax would be. You can't have a guarantee in the United Kingdom just now that your income tax will never go up, because you don't know what the policy of the current government will be at next year's budget. You don't know what will happen if a different government is elected. So, these are decisions that will be made in elections in Scotland. What I can tell you is that right now, if Scotland becomes independent, we will be relatively better off than the rest of the UK. Again, going back to the expenditure and revenue
still in
figures.
deficit?
Well, yes, but nevertheless,
quite a large deficit,
better off.
even with all of the oil, or a geographical share of the oil.
As a percentage of our GDP, we'd be less in deficit than the UK. We'd have a lower overall debt than the UK. The most recent figures showed that, relatively speaking, we're £4.4 billion better off than the UK. That's more than 800 quid for every man, woman and child in this country. Now, if you have access to that resource, you can make decisions about it. You can spend more, you can pay off debt, you can save. We don't have access to that.
You retain grand ambitious spending plans, and John Rowland doesn't seem convinced that income tax would. Can you give a guarantee about your? You're talking about Labour. Give a guarantee about your.
We've no plans to increase income. I'm not going to tell you what our manifesto in the 2016 election is going to say. That will be decided in the 2016 election. And that's, if George Osborne was sitting here right now, perish the thought, but if he was sitting here right now, he wouldn't tell you what income tax rates he was going to set in next year's budget. I know we've just had the budget, but in next year's budget, and nor am I going to sit here right now and tell you what our manifesto is going to say in 2016.
Douglas Renton, Edinburgh. Will North Sea oil revenue be an essential part of Scotland's income?
Well, this is one of the most odd things I think about the whole debate in Scotland. Our opponents treat North Sea oil as if it's some kind of liability and handicap and dreadful burden for
John
the
Swinney's
people
leaked cabinet paper described
Scotland.
it as volatile and therefore not to be relied upon.
Hold the front page. Oil revenues have a certain volatility about them.
But he warned cabinet colleagues, including you, to hold back on spending because oil was volatile.
We've seen the industry itself revise its predictions for production and price over the period since that cabinet paper.
So John Swinney's paper a year ago was wrong. The figures have been overtaken.
John Swinney was doing what our opponents always say we should be doing, which is plan very carefully and very cautiously, make sure we're looking at all of the options.
He's trying to put the frighteners on cabinet colleagues.
I'm sure not for the first time or the last. I'm sure he's a very cautious and a very good finance secretary. But the paper we published that was published a couple of weeks ago about oil predictions show exactly the strength of oil. But the point I was going to make,
Office of Budget
which comes
Responsibility,
back,
completely disagree with that.
Well, the Office of Budget Responsibility...
8 billion minimum less.
Well, the Office of Budget Responsibility, of course, I think said we would have over 2% growth this year, and since they've downgraded that prediction twice. But what I was going to say, to try to answer the question, is oil and gas revenues are important to the Scottish economy. I'm not going to sit here and say they're not. That's why I believe we should have access to them in order that we can use them more wisely. But if you look at them as a percentage of our total economy, it's less than they are as a percentage of Norway's economy. Norway is, in that sense, more dependent on oil and gas, and nobody in the world would say that Norway is not a viable, successful, prosperous, independent country. They've also got an oil fund worth, I think, more than £400 billion right now. What have we got to show for oil that we discovered round about the same time as Norway. Now, we're on the verge of a next generation of oil bonanza. Are we going to make the same mistake twice, or are we going to say, actually, we're going to steward this better and leave something for future generations?
Ross Mason, Cumbernauld, thanks for that. Ross Mason, Cumbernauld, thanks for your question. He reckons the SNP government would be saddled under independence with a huge bill for a bill for the Scotland's share of the UK's national debt. He puts it at 140 billion.
There's different ways you could calculate Scotland's share of the national debt, but we will have to take our fair share of that. Nobody is quibbling about that. The point I made earlier on, and again, this is not
population-based, 8% or something like that.
Well, you could take a per capita population-based share, or you could look at the GERS figures going back and look at what we've contributed to that debt over the years, and that will be a matter for negotiation. Well, the GERS figures already take into account the borrowing associated with the banking bailout. But the point I'm making here is that, even at the upper ends of what a fair share of the UK's debt would be for Scotland, it would leave us with a debt position as a lower percentage of our GDP than is the case for the UK as a whole. But the fact that as part of the UK, with oil revenues flowing into the Treasury, we're in the position of being, to use the phraseology, burdened with a share of the UK's debt, surely is not an argument for the same system. It's a strange argument that the unionist parties use. We've burdened you with debt. Your economy's in recession. Stay with us. Actually, these are arguments for independence and doing things differently in future.
Let's turn to, but perhaps finally, we'll see how we go, to questions on the European Union. Pete, no second name. Why are the SNP being less than honest with the Scottish public on the relationship of Scotland and the European Union?
Well, I don't accept that. I mean, I've laid this out in Parliament in parliamentary statements. If Scotland votes to become independent on September the 18th next year, we will have a period of negotiation with the UK government around the terms of the independence settlement. In parallel to that, we will negotiate the terms of our continued membership of the European Union, and we've set that out very clearly and very honestly. But I would turn that question back. Nobody seriously is saying that Scotland, with all of the oil and gas revenues that we've just been talking about, with the fishing resources we've got, with the thousands of European nationals that live in Scotland just now, with everything we contribute to the European table, that Europe would somehow want either Scotland to be outside permanently or to leave in order to be brought back in.
You said until relatively recently it would be automatic and there wouldn't even be negotiations. You had to change that position. You got it wrong in the first place.
I can't remember the date in December, but I set it out very clearly to Parliament, and
finally,
of course there will be
after
a process,
previously saying something else.
Well, there will be a process of negotiation. I accept that, but the point I'm making is that it is not credible to say that Scotland would not be a welcome continuing member of the European Union.
Nicola Sturgeon speaking to our political editor Brian Taylor earlier this morning. Well, we'll be crossing back to Inverness very shortly to hear the First Minister's speech. In the meantime, Professor Curtis is still with me. You were listening to that, John, and Money Talks, interesting to hear. That was pretty much at the top of the agenda for our viewers' questions.
Indeed, it was fascinating to hear the whole range of questions about the economy. Certainly, all the work I've done on public opinion in Scotland suggests at the end of the day, whether or not people in Scotland is convinced that an independent Scotland would be more prosperous or not is going to be central, and there are a lot of questions being asked about that. I think also kind of what was particularly interesting was that long sustained debate and interchange between Brian and Nicola about the issue of monetary union. Now, of course, one understands why the SNP want to go down this path, and it is because, of course, that if it were to be the idea that the pound in people's pockets was suddenly going to change as a result of independence, then arguably there might be a greater uncertainty and fear about what that might imply. The problem the SNP faces is that in the wake of the Eurozone crisis and in the wake of the fact that most European governments, including the United Kingdom, are now increasing their debt at very fast rates, is that the lesson of the Eurozone crisis is that if you share a currency with another country, you have to have some agreement about how much debt the government has in the short run. And so therefore this argument that the SNP are trying to pursue of, well, look, we don't want to have our own currency, but we would then have fiscal freedom. The argument that's coming from the Better Together side is, well, but hang on, actually you would have to come to an agreement with the UK government about your level of debt. The second thing, obviously, to say about the backdrop of which now this referendum is taking, of course, is that because of the levels of debt that most governments have and a Scottish government would inherit, they're actually relying primarily on monetary policy, including not least printing money, which is what the Bank of England's been doing over the last few years to try and stimulate the economy. So clearly, as a result of changed economic circumstances, certainly you can see why people are asking questions about whether the stance that the SNP think an independent Scotland should take on these issues is being so important. The other thing you can also see out of that conversation, again, I think one of the reasons why the Yes side sometimes has some difficulty with its arguments is the degree to which what the SNP's vision for an independent Scotland relies on negotiating with other parties. So they're looking for a negotiation with the UK government that Scotland could indeed be a part of a Sterling zero. But that's something that both sides have to agree on. They're looking to negotiate with the European Union that Scotland's continued membership of that body. But again, it involves negotiation. Now, nobody's saying that those are unreasonable stances, but it does make it difficult for the SNP to be able to say to people, well, we can guarantee that this and this will happen, because in truth they can't. They can guarantee that will be their negotiating stance, but they can't necessarily guarantee what the outcome is going to be.
Because the trouble is, of course, the UK government say they won't pre-negotiate anything, which I suppose is a strategic decision, which leaves the nationalists in that kind of difficult position where they can't give facts to people, and people are maybe looking for
I think
facts.
there is no doubt that the UK government is not striving to make the SNP's life any easier on this issue. They are deliberately saying we are refusing to give you any indication of what we would say post a yes vote in the referendum, which therefore leaves the SNP having to argue that we think actually it would be in the United Kingdom's interest to keep Stirling inside the Stirling area. Well, at the end of the day, of course, it would be for the United Kingdom itself to decide what is in its interest, and maybe the SNP are right, maybe not. But undoubtedly, yes, that creates some difficulty.
Does that backfire, though, for the UK government, that they won't pre-negotiate, and Scots are maybe looking for facts and they can't get them?
Well, certainly, I think insofar as indeed the Electoral Commission, when it did its focus groups, was saying, look, actually we think, given the mood of the public in Scotland, there is a requirement on both sides to lay out what might happen in the event of both a yes vote and a no vote. One could argue, indeed, that the UK government could be criticised for perhaps not being more upfront about what it might be willing to do in the event of a yes vote. And equally, of course, one could argue that so far the reluctance of the Better Together campaign to get involved in about, well, what more devolution might the Scottish Parliament have in the event of there being a no vote, that equally they could be criticised again for not engaging in that debate. And that therefore, as a result, it may well be that many voters feel that they're not quite clear what a yes vote means, because that depends on negotiation, and they're not quite sure what a no vote means, because that will depend on agreement between the political parties, and that therefore to some degree they're being asked to make a choice in to some degree of fog. Well, of course the truth is, in war, fog is often an important weapon, and we shouldn't be surprised that both sides are going to use it on occasions.
John, we should be about 3 minutes away, I'm estimating, from Mr Salmond beginning to speak. You were talking about that he would be addressing the delegates in the hall. I suppose they have a job of work to do. What do you think he might tell them to try to convince them, to convince others about independence?
Well, I think one of the things clearly what we're anticipating he's going to do, and we should remember, by the way, this is a party conference. This is not actually a conference of the Yes Scotland campaign. It's meant to be a conference about a political party which is actually extraordinarily successful. 6 years into power, its poll ratings are still at around 43-45% in Hollywood voting intentions, as good as they were 2 years ago. More people are satisfied with them than dissatisfied. A poll this morning confirmed that, and indeed also people are satisfied with Alex Salmond. But the trouble is, it's not clear that popularity is being translated into a willingness of the public to follow the SNP on the independence issue. And in particular, one of the difficulties the SNP have, of course, behind its popularity as a party, is the widespread perception in Scotland that it provides Scotland with effective devolved government. And there's plenty of evidence to indeed, that's what the public thinks. And the SNP have long been hoping that by doing that and demonstrating that they can make Scottish government work, that the public would then be persuaded of the merits of independence. The trouble is that the evidence seems to be, and Scottish Social Activists, for example, has got quite a lot on this, is actually since 2007, since that effective devolved government has been provided to Scotland, the reaction of the public in Scotland is to become rather less critical of the Union than it once was. So in the early years of devolution, people were twice as likely to think that England benefited economically most from the Union than Scotland did. Now, since 2007, that's been pretty much even Stevens between the two sides. We're less likely to think now that we're not getting our fair share of public spending. So almost ironically, that because indeed the SNP seem to be defending Scotland's interests effectively within the Union, they're providing Scotland with effective government, some people seem to be saying, well, no, so therefore, no, therefore do we need independence? So the problem for the SNP is the more they promote their own record in office, they're at risk of cutting across their wish to persuade people that actually the Union is a body that they should no longer wish to be a member of.
John, Nicola Sturgeon is just introducing Alex Salmond at the moment in the hall. She is a woman who is at the forefront of the independence campaign, isn't she, taking on a lead role? Oh
yes, I mean I think one of the things clearly is very important about this government is that it's not a one-man show, and Nicola Sturgeon in particular plays a crucial role in advancing Alex Salmond's position within the party.
Alex Salmond walking into the conference hall now, being greeted by Nicola Sturgeon. Alex Salmond, SNP leader, about to address the delegates now at the Eden Court Theatre in Inverness.
I'm just trying to work out how to answer that information about the Communities' Cup final. I think it was the fact that President Banda kept leaning across to me during the last half hour and saying, "Which one is your team again?" And I said, "Madam President, they're all my teams." But as Nicola said, a week, friends, is a long time in politics. On Thursday, we announced the date of the independence referendum, Scotland's date with destiny. And within a few minutes, my advisers told me that I was trending in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Delegates, I was so disappointed. I thought they said I was trendy in Edinburgh and Glasgow. Well, meet Coolek fae Buchan. But the point I was trending was on the 18th of September 2014. We'll have the opportunity to ensure that decisions about Scotland are taken by the people who care most about Scotland, the people who live in Scotland. You know, few nations and very few generations are fortunate enough to take such an important decision. We are, in every sense, friends, the lucky ones. It's a vote for the people of Scotland, of course, every citizen aged 16 and upwards, and rightly so. But don't underestimate the positive lesson to the wider world of a nation deciding its future by debate and democracy. It was the former President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, who last October described Scotland's referendum as a remarkable and wonderful phenomenon. And so whether you are yes, no, or like many at this stage, a dinny ken, we can all be proud that our nation is embarked on such an exciting journey in an impeccably democratic way. The 18th September 2014 is the day when every one of us will be asked to take the future of our country into our hands. And for years to come, people will be asked to say by friends, neighbours, children, grandchildren, to say how they voted on that day. And when that question comes, as come it will, let's make sure that each one of us can proudly say, yes, I was one of those who voted by majority for a new and better Scotland. Now, this party has never wavered in our commitment to trust the people of Scotland with that decision. While the Westminster parties ganged up to block a referendum in the last Parliament when the SNP were a minority government, We held fast to Scotland's democratic rights. The sovereignty of the Scottish people is in our DNA. This moment, Scotland's moment, was the life work of dedicated servants of Scotland, such as the much-missed Jimmy Halliday. When Jimmy led our party in the 1950s, a referendum to achieve an independent Scotland was just a dream, but one he never wavered from. And the work of Jimmy and countless others have made their dream our reality. We thank them now, and we thank them best by achieving that yes vote in the referendum. And it's because that we've always trusted the people. I believe they'll put their trust in the Yes campaign on the 18th of September next year and vote with those of us who want to build a prosperous economy and a just society. Next year will be a huge year for Scotland, not just for politics, but for a range of events which will focus the attention of the planet in our country. The Commonwealth Games, the Ryder Cup, the second homecoming year. And we're going to make sure that each of these events is a success for Scotland and also a catalyst for positive change. Exactly a year ago, I announced the establishment of a £10 million fund to help local communities bring sports facilities across Scotland into the 21st century. This year, we're going further, adding another £7 million to this initiative, meaning that almost 80 projects across Scotland will be completed in good time for the Commonwealth Games. So whether it's snow sports in Midlothian, for which there's plenty of raw material, Olympic swimming pools in Dundee and Aberdeen, Fiji pitches in Dumfries and Galloway, or the outdoor facility, community and facility in Aviemore, these will achieve great benefits to the people of Scotland. Our aim is to inspire Scots, young and old, to seize the opportunity presented by the Commonwealth Games to become a better nation. Friends, it's said that to govern is to choose. But even more fundamental than that is to choose how you are governed. That choice, the real choice, becomes clearer by the day. The opportunity to use our vast resources and talent to build a better country, or continue under Westminster, which simply isn't working for the people of Scotland. A system that's not worked in the past, is not working now, and will not work in the future. Take, for example, the big issues in the Scottish Parliament last week. They illustrate exactly why an independent Scotland is the right choice. It is 10 years since the Scottish Parliament first debated the Iraq War, when a catalogue of deception by a Labour Prime Minister, led the UK into an illegal conflict that came at the most enormous human cost. Almost 5,000 Allied soldiers, 179 from the United Kingdom. Well over 100,000 Iraqi civilians lost their lives as a result of a foreign policy disaster which made Suez look like a picnic in the sun. Now, when our brave servicemen and women are sent into danger, we have a duty to give them our full support. But we have an equal duty to discuss the reasons why. The people who elected us to public office expect nothing less. However, the no campaign parties in the Scottish Parliament actually tried to gag us this week from debating Iraq. Labour even claimed it was not a real issue in Scotland. Try telling the families who lost a loved one in the war in Iraq that it wasn't a real issue. Try telling them it should be airbrushed away. The reality of the situation is that our opponents want to avoid confronting their demons because they know that they backed an illegal war based on a lie, the myth of weapons of mass destruction. In the Scottish Parliament, there are still 8 of the Tory MSPs and 15 Labour MPs who voted for the Iraq war, including their leader. 11 of the Scottish Labour MPs who voted for the war are still in the House of Commons, including no campaigner-in-chief Alistair Darling. Another 10 have been elevated, if that's the right word, to the House of Lords. Labour and the Tories and Labour, they were wrong together about the Iraq war 10 years ago, and they should apologise together now.
Friends, the imposition of the poll tax by Margaret Thatcher persuaded the majority of people that we needed a parliament with the powers to stop such divisive social experiments being visited ever again on Scotland. Instead of being just a good idea, a parliament became necessary if we were to protect Scotland's social fabric and ensure that our domestic policy reflected the will of our people. Tony Blair's legacy is to demonstrate why Scotland now needs to go further. The catastrophe of Iraq shows why our Parliament has to have the powers of independence, so that never again can Scotland be dragged into an illegal war under false pretences. I'm certain that the lie that led to Iraq would not have been perpetrated by the government of an independent Scotland of any political persuasion. But we have to be absolutely certain. Other countries, including Denmark, the Netherlands, Ireland, have constitutional guarantees that they will not go to war without a proper process of parliamentary approval. And a similar such undertaking could be written into the constitution of an independent Scotland. Friends, I believe it should be. Indeed, it has to be, to demonstrate that our new Scotland is something worth voting for. That is part of the why of independence. Now, the US-UK invasion of Iraq was about non-existent weapons of mass destruction. But delegates, there are real weapons of mass destruction. Weapons inspectors would have no problem whatsoever in finding them in Scotland. Just 150 miles from here, the Trident missile system is based on the Clyde estuary, just along the road from our most populous city, with an estimated cost for its renewal of up to £100 billion. Trident was conceived by the Tories, presided over by Labour, just as Polaris before it was conceived by Labour and presided over by the Tories. The process of its renewal for another 50 years, another half of a century, is happening under a Tory Lib Dem coalition supported by Labour. Trident is Westminster's ultimate vanity obscenity, but now it's entirely dependent on next year's vote. Because, delegates, it's now clear that the only way we can finally remove these weapons of mass destruction from Scotland is with a yes vote to independence. And that is also part of the why of independence. Friends, I'm proud to lead a government which has made the Scottish Parliament work for our people. That's why the Scottish Social Attitudes Survey showed that 71% of people trust Holyrood to act in Scotland's best interests, 4 times more than trust Westminster. In the face of the most appalling financial pressures, we have chosen a different path from Westminster, a path that reflects Scottish social democratic consensus politics, our shared progressive values, our priorities as a society. On all of the key domestic issues, Scotland trumps Westminster. Down south, the UK government's own figures reveal that England will see a 16,000 reduction in the number of police officers. And to compound this, the starting wage of new officers is to be reduced. South of the border, the thin blue line has just got a lot thinner. In contrast, the SNP government has delivered and protected 1,000 extra police officers in the streets and communities of Scotland. A great achievement, and one which Labour said would take us 13 years. Just next week, Scotland's new National Police Force comes into place, along with Scotland's new Fire and Rescue Service. Friends, this government will always value the work of our emergency services. The people who have been mobilised all of last night helping their fellow citizens. It is our approach to frontline policing that has delivered not just a 37-year low in recorded crime, but also a fall in the fear of crime that causes such misery. That's why, when it comes to the Police Federation Conference, Kenny McCaskill, Scotland's Justice Minister, gets cheered to the rafters, and why his Tory counterpart at Westminster gets booed off the stage. On health, Scotland protects frontline health spending, despite the Westminster cuts and the huge pressures on the budget. Prescription charges, the tax on the sick, have been abolished in Scotland, even as they rise to £7.85 in England. £7.85. We have record patient satisfaction with our health service, the job our health professionals do often in hugely difficult circumstances. We have maintained a genuine national health service in Scotland, free at the point of need, even as the NHS has been fragmented and privatised south of the border, started by Labour and now under the Tories. Professor Don Berwick is a world-renowned expert in patient safety. He's just been appointed the new health czar. He's a former advisor to President Obama. This is what he says about the strength of our Scottish system. The Scottish Patient Safety Programme marks Scotland as a leader, second to no nation on earth, in its commitment to reducing harm to patients dramatically and continually. That always has to be our goal. In every aspect of our health service and indeed national life, second to no nation on earth. Delegates, it was 4 years ago at our conference that Nicola Sturgeon announced that we would drive out privatisation of cleaning services in the National Health Service. Since then, healthcare acquired infections have dropped by 80%. Is there any more vindication needed of Alec Neil's determination to have a publicly run National Health Service free at the point of need? The delegates, we don't control the towering heights of the economy, but we do have economic powers, and we've used these to help the small business sector, the backbone of our economy. They have the best aid and support available anywhere in these islands. We've used the influence we have to win more jobs from inward investment compared to any other part of these islands, including London. And now we have lower unemployment, including youth unemployment, than the UK as a whole. 1 year ago, youth unemployment was almost 25%, as young people bore the brunt of the Labour-Tory recession. Then we appointed Scotland's First Minister for Youth Employment, gathered together our stakeholders from the Scottish Trade Union Congress to business, almost doubled the number of apprenticeships, focused college courses on full-time preparation for jobs, introduced the Youth Guarantee for 16 to 19-year-olds. And what's been the result? In 1 year, youth unemployment has gone down by a third, from 103,000 to 68,000. Still far too high, but a dramatic difference to the lives of thousands of youngsters in Scotland. On the figures released this week, all of the UK fall of 34,000 over the year in youth unemployment took place in Scotland. Friends, what a demonstration of the work of Angela Constance as Scotland's First Minister for Youth Employment. Now, these have been substantial successes, substantial progress. But we can't allow them to be blown away in an eternal economic winter of Westminster austerity. This week's Westminster budget, the Cameron-Osborne budget, follows a familiar pattern. Fizz on the day, a hangover the day after. Even the fizz only lasted until we found out they'd swiped another £50 million from the Scottish budget for this coming year without so much as a buy your leave. But there is much more bad news coming in the detail of the budget. Analysis by the Institute of Fiscal Studies shows that from 2016, the Westminster budget means either £500 tax rises for every family or further cuts in public services, which they describe as eye-watering. That's the grim future that awaits Scotland or Scottish families under Westminster rule. And would there be a different prospectus from Her Majesty's official opposition in Westminster, the Labour Party? No, not a chance. At Westminster, they dance to the Tory tune. In Scotland, they are preparing to rip up all the social gains of devolution. This week was one of Labour abstention, all through this week, in votes in Holyrood and Westminster. They abstained on the war. They abstained on Trident. They abstained on bus passes. They even abstained on workfare at Westminster. Labour, the great abstainers on everything, except, of course, minimum pricing for alcohol, which they opposed. We offer a different future. At Holyrood, we will defend these social gains, policies such as free personal care and bus passes for older folk who have paid their taxes, powered our economy, raised their children and deserve something back from society. That's what it means to have a society. And the rocks will melt with the sun before we allow Tory or Labour to remove free education from our young people in Scotland. Delegates, as we've heard a few moments ago, the Yes campaign is predicated on the compelling truth that decisions about Scotland are best made by the people who live and work here. That was once a theory. It's now an indisputable fact. Since the restoration of our Parliament in 1999, we have demonstrated that law and order, health, education, business support, and in the great social services of Scotland, our Parliament delivers the policies that are right for Scotland and reflect the views and votes of the people of Scotland. That is the prize and purpose of self-government. And if it's true in these devolved areas, it is equally true in all areas of public life. That is the prize and purpose of an independent Scotland. With each passing day, it becomes clearer that the Westminster system is not fit for any purpose. It is further away than ever from Scotland's values and well past its time. The iniquitous bedroom tax is the latest example. In a House of Commons debate led by the SNP and our allies in Plaid Cymru, over 90% of Scottish MPs voted against it. We know from the Scottish Government research that the extra cost that the bedroom tax will impose on the Scottish economy will outweigh any savings that the UK Government makes, even before we factor in wider social costs, the distress, the disruption it will cause to families. But still, it is to be imposed on Scotland. And to add insult to injury, the architect of this shambles, Ian Duncan Smith, has to be dragged kicking and screaming to deign to defend this policy to a committee of our national parliament. Friends, this is an iniquitous, unfair, anti-family imposition conceived because of runaway rent levels in the south. Why should people who would impose such iniquity have any power or authority over the Scottish people? Friends, we've already acted to mitigate the worst impacts of welfare changes. Acting with COSLA, we have sheltered hundreds of thousands of families from council tax rises. We have established loan funds. We increased support for advice centres. And today I can announce that all SNP-led local authorities will follow the lead of Dundee in halting the threat of evictions from this disgraceful tax from those struggling to pay. However, friends, what Scotland needs is not mitigation but power. Not just a defence against Westminster, but a removal of Westminster authority over the Scottish people. Delegates, last year I made a speech pointing out the opportunities to grow the Scottish economy with control over our taxation policy. No one in this world owes Scotland a living. Every policy we articulate needs to focus on our competitive position as an economy. That is part of the why of independence. Today I want to illustrate why social change can also release the untapped potential of Scotland and make us not just a prosperous economy but also a just society, and why these concepts go hand in hand, a prosperous economy and a just society. Last week, the unemployment figures showed Scots unemployment below the UK average. Have a look behind these figures and see a glaring inequality which holds our nation back. 66% of women of working age are in employment compared to 76% of men. Now that's not down to lack of talent. Women now make up 55% of entrants into higher education, and the number of modern apprenticeship starts for women has increased from 27% to 43%. But in terms of lower numbers of women in employment, it doesn't have to be like that. Elsewhere in Europe, the gender gap is much, much less. If we close the opportunity gap, we could add to our national wealth and to our taxation base by mobilising the skills of women back into the workforce. But there would be another change, a fundamental opportunity to improve the life chances of many of our children. We have long cherished the ambition to increase preschool education. Our first term, we moved it from 412 hours to 475 free nursery hours per annum. That benefits 100,000 children a year. Last year, I announced a step further, a statutory guarantee by law of 600 hours of free nursery education for every 3- and 4-year-old and for every looked-after 2-year-old in our land. That's a statement of faith and commitment to the future. It's been carried forward, incidentally, without the fears of lower standards that are now prevalent south of the border. It's going to be flexible in its delivery, using the wisdom of the early year task force to help us, but it's also definite in its intent. For every young mum and dad juggling with work and parenthood, the SNP government is here for you and your family. And that is what we can achieve with a devolved Parliament. But devolution can only take Scotland so far. We don't have the financial freedom to give us the biggest bang for our buck, to invest in areas where Scotland could make huge social and therefore economic strides. So let us consider what more we could achieve in an independent Scotland. I've asked the Council of Economic Advisers to produce an analysis of the economic and social impact of Scotland moving to the levels of support for childcare commonplace across other European countries. Our ambitions for childcare are the hallmark of our approach to social and economic policy. We promote the measures we do because they advance both our economy and our society. Some argue there's a contradiction between the two, but the reality is that progressive social policy boosts the economy, and a dynamic economy enables us to build the fairer society we need. Each is the handmaiden of the other. It will not be done in a day or a year, or even completed in the first term of an independent Parliament. But I believe a transformational shift towards childcare should be one of the first tasks of an independent Scotland. That too is part of the why of independence. Friends, ours is a noble cause, because we are arguing for the rights and responsibilities not of ourselves but of our country. We're arguing for something that's bigger than any individual, any party, any campaign, the benefits of which will endure for generations to come. The biggest advantage of the Yes campaign is that we put no limits on the ability of this nation to build prosperity and well-being for all our people. The biggest problem of the No campaign is their fear and scorn of a Scotland aspiring to equality of status among the nations of the world. Our opponents in the No campaign will say and do anything to keep Scotland where they think it should be. In terms of GDP per head, right now an independent Scotland would be the 8th wealthiest country in a league table of the world's most developed nations. If the No campaign believe that Scotland doesn't have what it takes economically to be an independent country, they must think that only the 7 countries above Scotland can be independent. And incidentally, the UK wouldn't be one of them, because it trails at number 17, overtaken this year by Iceland. Delegates, our opponents say that Scotland can't afford to be independent. I say that Scotland can't afford not to be independent. To listen to the No campaign, to listen to the Unionist parties, you'd have to believe that a generation of Trident nuclear weapons in the Clyde was a fantastic asset, and having generations of oil and gas revenue to come was a huge problem. That's the looking glass fantasy they want Scotland to believe, but the people aren't daft. They know that Scottish energy resources are the asset, Trident is the problem, and Westminster is the liability. Combining the natural and human resources of Scotland is the way to fairness and prosperity. Our call for the 18th of September next year is a call to optimism and to progress. You know, there was a referendum once when Scotland was cheated out of our right to self-government. Listen to just this one example. Among the tirade of scare stories used to frighten people into voting no to self-government in 1979, it was a Daily Express editorial but 10 days before the referendum. It said, "How much of Scotland's economy will be left intact if a Scottish Assembly gets the go-ahead on March the 1st? Will our coal mines go gaily on? Will Ravenscraig or Linwood thrive? Will Bathgate flourish and Dounreay prosper?" No assembly came in 1979, and every plant and facility listed by the Express closed under Westminster rule. All gone, every one. Delegates will not be conned again. We achieved a parliament in 1997, overcoming a welter of scaremongering in that referendum, and we have never looked back. The latest survey shows that only 6% of Scots want to turn the clock back to having no parliament. It will be exactly the same with independence. All of the things they say now about independence, they were saying about devolution then. And we know they were wrong, because as a nation we have proved them wrong together over these last 14 years. We can all now look back and say, thanks to having a parliament, Scotland has a national health service worthy of the name, free education for young Scots, personal care for older Scots. None of these things exist south of the border, and none would exist in Scotland today without self-government. So I believe in 10 years' time that we'll look back and say, thanks to independence, we'll have a thriving economy, a welfare state worthy of the name, the best childcare system anywhere in these islands, and the obscenity of Trident nuclear weapons in the Clyde will be but a distant memory. Friends, the referendum for an independent Scotland is a precious opportunity, one given to no previous generation. We do not know if we will pass this way again. I believe that Scotland will vote yes next September. We'll give a renewed purpose to this old nation. And you sang the sound of better Scotland.
A standing ovation for the SNP leader and First Minister Alex Salmond in the hall at Eden Court in Inverness. He was talking about Scotland's date with destiny, the 18th of September, of course, saying decisions about Scotland should be taken by the people who live in Scotland. He said Westminster was a system that wasn't working, criticised the invasion of Iraq, the illegal wars he called it, and praised devolved policy triumphs such as police numbers, NHS and youth unemployment going down by a third, new policy announcement on the bedroom tax, and a call for optimism and progress. Standing ovation continuing there in the hall. Here in the studio with me is Professor John Curtis of Strathclyde University. John, you're just your initial impressions on hearing that speech?
Well, I think there were kind of three key themes in this speech, two of which were ones we're probably anticipating. One, however, had an interesting thing that wasn't there in the initial publicity. I mean, the first thing, undoubtedly, one major theme was, woe from Westminster. A lot of criticism of Westminster's record in the areas for which Westminster is still responsible and the Scottish Parliament is not. Iraq and Trident, the arguments about defence and foreign affairs, an area where we know at the moment the Scottish public need most convincing, should become Holyrood's responsibility. But also, again, the bedroom tax over welfare, again suggesting that Westminster is imposing on Scotland something it doesn't want, trying to repeat some of the arguments that were made, therefore, in advance of devolution in the 1980s and 1990s. That's clearly one theme. Second theme, as we were expecting, the success of the Scottish Government, what we've been able to achieve, but trying to use that to try and persuade people, look, actually, given the success, this isn't a reason to hold back, this isn't a reason to say this is enough, this is sufficient, rather it's a reason to want to go further. But then thirdly, of course, there was undoubtedly the attempt to put forward a vision for Scotland. We heard the rhetoric as we were anticipating about it both being a prosperous and a more socially just society. But I think what was particularly interesting about the focus of his vision in this particular speech was an apparent appeal to women, saying he wanted to get more women involved in the labour market, wanting to improve childcare, to make Scotland the best place for childcare in the world. And I think to that extent, here's perhaps was an implicit recognition that certainly one of the key barriers towards the yes side winning the referendum is undoubtedly the fact that there's a much greater reticence amongst women to support independence, about 12% lower level of support for independence in the recent polls than there is amongst men. And this looked like an attempt to say to women in Scotland, look, actually independence could deliver something particularly for you. And that I think was perhaps, in some senses, the new and most original part of the speech.
John, they're just having a bit of a photo call on the stage. The Alex Salmond with Nicola Sturgeon, SNP Deputy Leader. I think we're just going to hear maybe something again. He's back at the podium, actually. Still receiving that standing ovation. A few MSPs jumping up and down in the crowd there. One, Kevin Stewart from Aberdeen. He's just going to speak once again. Let's dip in and hear what he has to say.
Now, delegates, now, we've had our campaign orders from Mr. Canavan. And isn't it great to have him as chairman of the Yes campaign? So let's go out from this conference and get the job done for Scotland.
Final word there from the First Minister. That's him off the stage now. Final applause from the delegates at the conference there. Well, John, interesting just that final burst there. It's interesting, perhaps a bit of a flat speech, do you think?
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, yes, he got a standing ovation, but there were very few punctuating moments where the audience really were grabbed, where they clapped, and certainly there was no standing ovation of any kind in the middle of the speech. I have to say, I don't think this is going to go down as one of Alex Salmond's more stupendous speeches. He's usually a very effective platform speaker, but this did not sound quite like the vigorous, ebullient Alex Salmond and confident Alex Salmond that we're often used to. And to some extent, one therefore saw the fact that the audience did very rarely during the speech interrupted and had the kind of applause that you would normally expect, certainly from Alex Salmond, and indeed would usually hope to get, any party leader would hope to get. To that extent, at least, therefore, perhaps a little bit of a disappointment in terms of style in this speech.
John, thanks very much. Well, we're joined from the conference once again by Brian Taylor, our political editor. Brian, interesting to hear what John was saying there about style, but let's just pick up on the substance first of all. What were your impressions?
I was struck by the idea of continuity, the idea of a continuum, as I said at the outset. It was intriguing towards the end. He talked about the gains of the Scottish Parliament, and he mentioned one, free tuition fees at universities, that is down to his own government, with another one, free personal care, that's down to the previous Liberal Democrats and Labour. And he was arguing that you could move from that to independence as if it were part of a continuum. Now that's an ideological and philosophical difference that there is with the other side, who say, of course, independence is a break. They say it's not part of a continuum, a development from devolution. Another idea of continuum, he mentioned the poll tax, and of course the SNP led a non-payment campaign, or were heavily involved in a non-payment campaign against that. He then mentioned the so-called bedroom tax and suggested that SNP-led local councils would resist any evictions of tenants if they got into rent arrears. Presumably it's if they get into rent arrears as a consequence of losing an element of their benefit. Now, it's a relatively limited pledge, but nonetheless it's ideologically important because it balances with that previous poll tax announcement. I thought on the point of tone, John made the point about appealing to women voters. You know, they're not daft. They've done the survey evidence on this, and I reckon they're finding that bombast goes down generally not all that well, and it goes down particularly badly with females. And so I guess it's in that sense that he was perhaps moderating the tone to some extent. But I really think this idea of presumed continuity, which clashes exactly with the ideology advanced by the other side, is the one that I found most intriguing.
Brian, thank you very much for that. John Curtis, interesting, Brian, just weaving in perhaps the style point into the substance there.
Yes, I mean, interesting, and he may well be right. I mean, certainly it's been thought at times, particularly in his interchanges with Johan Lamont, the Labour leader, that in some senses he does indeed not necessarily debate quite as vigorously he is inclined to, because indeed it's inclined to put people off. I think more broadly, I think certainly Brian makes a very important point about the continuity of the speech. There was a very strong sense in the speech of trying to say, look, actually we're in a not dissimilar situation now to the 1980s and 1990s. That, you know, Westminster is doing us down, it's imposing things on us that we do not want, and that the natural step to success is for Scotland to take her own destiny, and using the examples of what the SNP and the DP, the previous Labour Democrat administration, had done as examples of how indeed things are supposedly better in Scotland once indeed it has a measure of self-government. So I think undoubtedly, in a sense, we are going to see Alex Salmond and the SNP trying to tap into the mood that led Scotland to vote for devolution and try to say to people, look, this is a step of a similar kind. It has to be said, kind of certainly one of the problems the yes side face at the moment is when you ask people in Scotland, what do you think would happen as a result of independence? You do not find anything like the same degree of optimism as there was with respect to devolution. On Scottish Socialities, we've asked virtually identical questions about what do you think would happen with respect to independence as we asked back in 1997 about devolution. And on things like the economy, for example, only half as many people are as optimistic about the economic consequences of independence as they were about devolution. So therefore, that undoubtedly there's work there for the SNP to do, and maybe they're hoping that this kind of argument will enable people to capture the spirit of devolution that they once had and transfer it to independence.
John, thanks very much for just now. Well, let's get more reaction to Alex Salmond's speech from the heart of the party. I'm joined from Inverness by the Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Good afternoon, Ms Sturgeon. Thanks for getting out the hall so quickly to join us. Thank you very much for that. Reaction to Mr Salmond's speech, a litany of woes against Westminster, it seems.
No, on the contrary, I thought the First Minister made a very powerful speech. He laid out very clearly, very passionately, but very rationally the case for independence. And that why of independence is about making sure we have the powers to grow our economy faster, to get more people into work, and therefore grow our tax base, to make sure that we can not just mitigate but stop in the first place some of the most iniquitous welfare changes that we're seeing coming from the UK government, that we can take the decision ourselves not to have Trident nuclear missiles on the River Clyde. So he set out a very clear case, and I thought it was a very rational and reasonable case for independence.
When it comes to the Iraq war, he of course called it a legal war. That of course is a debatable point. Of course the UK government at the time, the Labour government at the time, didn't believe it was. Their legal advice said it was legal, but he was criticising Alistair Darling for voting for it and wanting a proper process of parliamentary approval to be a new Scottish constitution. Well, at Westminster there was a proper process of parliamentary approval. It's a bit intellectually incoherent, isn't it?
Well, you know, what we now know beyond any shadow of a doubt, and you can debate about whether it's illegal or not, I'm absolutely firmly in the view that the Iraq war was illegal, but what is beyond any argument now is that the premise that was put forward by Tony Blair for going to war in Iraq has turned out to have been false. The idea that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction that could be deployed to our great threat within 45 minutes. Now that has been shown to be a false premise, and I think those those in the Labour Party and in the Tories who supported that war on the basis of that premise that was false should apologise, because as Alex Salmond was setting out there, that illegal war has come at enormous human cost and suffering and the loss of many, many thousands of lives.
Well, difficult foreign policy choices are made by every government. So you might be Foreign Secretary of an independent Scotland one day, you might be embroiled in a very controversial NATO decision, for example, now that you want to be in NATO.
Well, of course, difficult choices have to be made, but I think the people of any country, including the people of this country, have a right to expect that their governments, when making those choices, will make them honestly. And that's what I think it is now beyond any argument that Tony Blair did not do. So yes, difficult choices have to be made. We want to make sure it's written into a future Scottish constitution, the parliamentary role that has to be gone through before.
And there was a parliamentary role at Westminster, that was my point.
Into that constitution. I accept that point, but the point I'm making is that that's not written in. We want that written into a future Scottish constitution, and we also want to see a constitutional ban on nuclear weapons in Scotland. But of course,
a bit rich saying that now that you want to. It's a bit rich saying that now that you want to join Trident, and you could have US subs sailing up the Clyde, and being in NATO, you can't ask what's on board, can you?
Well, you know, the vast majority of NATO countries don't have nuclear weapons on their territory, so we'd be joining the majority in that respect. And as you know, because you covered it at the time, the motion that we debated openly as a party last October and passed to join NATO is predicated on us being able to get rid of nuclear weapons. But the point I'm making, the point I was coming on to make, is that that constitution, that ability to have a written constitution, something that many countries already have, is an opportunity we only get if we vote yes and become independent. And then the whole of Scotland, all political parties and people in no political parties, Civic Scotland, can be involved in the process of drawing up that constitution. That's one of the many benefits and opportunities of being an independent country.
When it comes to Westminster as well, Mr Salmond was also picking up on the bedroom tax, and he made the policy announcement that SNP-led local authorities will halt evictions. Is there now a postcode lottery when it comes to the bedroom tax in Scotland? Can the Scottish Government not try to address this problem in a more central way with a central fund?
We want to address the problem in a more central way. We want to have the powers so that we don't have the bedroom tax. That, again, is one of the reasons for being independent. We are doing everything we can as a government within a fixed budget, remember, to mitigate the worst effects of the welfare cuts. But far better than just being able to mitigate, surely it would be far better than that to have the power to stop these things happening in the first place, and that's what we're arguing for when we argue for independence.
We've been discussing in the programme how you need to appeal to women as a party to try to get them on board the Yes campaign, a real look at nursery places, but it is just a look, isn't it? The Council of Economic Advisors are kind of going to look at trying to improve nursery education in Scotland. Could there not have been a bit more of a firmer policy promise on that, do you think?
Well, we have, within the powers and resources that we already have, we've got a firm commitment that we are delivering to increase nursery provision. The First Minister said in his speech that we inherited a position, and we are working and will continue to work to improve upon that position. But the point he's making is that with the powers of independence, we can ensure that we deliver not just the right economic policies to get our economy growing, but the right social policies as well, getting more people, including more women, into work, growing the tax base, making the country wealthier, and in turn increasing our ability to deliver the social justice we want. And that's a pretty fundamental point that he's asked the Council of Economic Advisors to look at. But again, it's the kind of ability we only get if we're independent. Right now, if the Scottish Government introduces policies that grows the economy, we don't get the benefits of that. The benefits of that are felt elsewhere. We need to ensure that we've got the powers to get those benefits ourselves.
Well, when it comes to growing the economy, you're looking at unemployment. The First Minister was saying that youth unemployment had fallen by a third, and was perhaps taking the credit for that, or Angela Constance was going to take the credit for that. You blame Westminster when things are bad, but take the credit when things are good in Scotland.
Well, I mean, I think the First Minister made a pretty inescapable point that we had a level of youth unemployment that was far, far too high. We've still got a level of youth unemployment that is far too high, but in response to the levels that we had, we took decisive action. And one of the things the First Minister did was appoint our first dedicated Minister for Youth Employment. And as a result of that, we've seen levels of youth unemployment fall, because Angela Constance has been working with local authorities, with businesses across the country to make sure we have a concerted effort to do that, and we're seeing the fruits of that success. So it's not as far as we want to go. Those levels are still too high. But what it does demonstrate is that when we have some powers, we can use those powers effectively, and that's at the very heart of the argument for more powers, for having the full powers of an independent country.
Nicola Sturgeon, good to speak to you again. Thanks very much for joining me. Thank you.
Andrew.
Now, delegates have been debating the issue of universal benefits this morning. It comes after Labour's Joanne Lamont said there should be an inquiry into what's affordable. Here's a flavour of what was said.
Conference, this resolution is absolutely about a choice between two futures for Scotland. It's a choice between preserving the founding principles of our welfare state and dismantling them. And it's been enormously affirming to have the Jimmy Reid Foundation support our commitment to universalism in their report, this report which I commend to you. The report is clear that SNP and the Greens are now the only parliamentary parties willing to articulate the principles of universalism, from each according to ability to each according to need, from the cradle to the grave. The report also notes that on virtually every possible measure of social and economic success, all league tables are topped by societies with strong universal welfare states. And Conference, we in SNP are daring to be ambitious for a future in the top of those league tables too, starting any time after 18 September 2014. For a Scotland in which we really are all in it together, with a welfare system where our citizens have a shared experience of key passages through life: childhood, parenthood, old age, education, health. In the words of Mark MacDonald, MSP, it's not rich people or poor people who need prescriptions, it's sick people who need prescriptions. Conference, the research has always been clear that universal benefits are the most efficient way of reaching those in need. They promote social cohesion, they help mitigate against economic downturn, they need minimal bureaucratic intrusion and minimal administrative cost. What Joanne Lamont and Labour and our friends in the Tories and Lib Dems offer us are more cuts, more means testing, with its intrusive and increasingly privatised bureaucracy. This is stigmatising, costly, inefficient and, not surprisingly, shunned by many in real need, especially the old. So billions of pounds in benefits go unclaimed whilst fraud and resentment rise. This diminishes the status of the poor and deepens inequality. Conference, the Jimmy Reid Foundation is very clear on this. When Joanne Lamont says that we live in a something-for-nothing society in which the rich benefit from freebies, she dismisses the principle of universalism entirely. So Joanne Lamont has leapt even further to the right, but perhaps worst of all is that she presents this leap as redistribution, as somehow morally superior and economically more responsible. As the Jimmy Reid Foundation says, that this right-wing political philosophy is now redefined as left-wing philosophy is one of the most corrosive pieces of political drift we have seen in Scotland. Conference, this is miserable politics that speaks a language of petty resentment and social division. It's irresponsible, it ignores the facts, and it plays fast and loose with a precious, hard-won social inheritance. Conference, let's keep on daring to be ambitious for Scotland's future. Support the determination of our colleagues in government in their fight to keep universal benefits and support a motion. Thank you.
Let there be no doubt, the reintroduction of tuition fees or any graduate contribution would be a reprehensible move towards the marketisation of our education system. It would inhibit social mobility and punish those who benefit the most from higher education. They're a cynical tool, waved around by parties seeking cheap headlines, ignorant of the human cost of their proposals. Although not every young person wants to attend university, it is deeply offensive to burden that personal choice with further financial implications. Attending university should be based on the ability to learn and not the ability to pay. Why do Labour want to pull up the ladder on our next generation of doctors, nurses and social workers, and then privatise the NHS those doctors, nurses and social workers would be part of? Do they really think that emulating the Tories paves the way to a better society in Scotland? We know that there is no societal case for limiting higher education to those who can pay. However, there is no financial case for it either. The Reid Foundation has reported that the Labour Party's initial proposals would raise, at best, 2% of the university sector's funding over the course of the next 15 years. A generation scarred by stunted dreams and lost opportunity for the sake of 2%. Is that a price worth paying? I don't think so. I'm proud that the student movement has continued to press the case against fees, ensuring that the betrayal of students perpetrated elsewhere in the UK by the Tory Liberal coalition does not take place in Scotland. I'm also proud to be a member of the SNP, a party that refuses point blank to drop its principled stance on free education and recognises the social and economic value to Scotland of an education system free from fees.
When I read the amendment's language, I thought, oh, that's a bit intemperate. There's some nasty stuff going on in there. In conference, I think it's about time. I think it's about time that we got angry about what's being done. Conference, an attack on the vulnerable, as is being carried out by the welfare policies in Westminster Government, supported by the Labour Party in Scotland, is an attack on all of us. Universality is a crucial element, in my view, of a welfare system that includes all citizens. If you attack one citizen, you attack us all. Conference, the great English political theorist T.H. Marshall wrote in 1949 about the concept of social citizenship. That concept of social citizenship sets out the responsibilities that government has to its citizens. And one of these responsibilities is surely an ambition to provide the best education system it can. And I support this amendment because the idea set out by Joanne Lamont, the idea that free education means a reduction in standards, is the most appalling and miserable response to an ambitious policy that you can imagine. It's an attack on our schools and universities, and we should not and cannot accept it. I work in a university, and I will not accept it. Fellow nationalists, our young people have a right to be the best they can be, and our government has a responsibility to help them achieve all that they can. Now, like Kirsty in the film we saw earlier, I don't want £9,000 fees for students. I also benefited from a free university education. And I don't want to live in a society where the government, as it has in England, takes the view that there is no public benefit in higher education. Think about what that means for citizenship. Think about what that means for democratic debate and participation. It's an appalling prospect. Conference, I believe in public benefit. I believe in social citizenship. I believe in our young people. And I believe that independence is the way to protect these things. So please support this amendment.
Well, let's get more reaction from Inverness now. We're joined by the Finance Secretary, John Swinney. Good afternoon, Mr. Swinney. Thanks very much for joining me, and very interesting debate there. In an independent Scotland, would you promise to maintain all of these benefits that have been spoken about there by the delegates?
Yes, that's a fundamental part of the compact that we've made with the people of Scotland under devolution. It's part of the agenda of our government because we think it's important that government is clear with people about the entitlement that they will have from the services that we put in place. And that position would be no different in the government of an independent Scotland, where we make a bond with the people of our country and we stay true to that bond about the type of services that they will be entitled to and the way in which we would deliver those services.
Well, in response to Mr Salmond's speech this afternoon, Labour have put out something saying that when it comes to free education, it's essentially robbing Peter to pay Paul, to paraphrase him. Free education means cuts to college places, free prescriptions means no access to cancer drugs, bus passes means routes are cut, and free care means that visits are reduced to 15 minutes only.
Well, I think that sums up the generally pretty uncheerful approach of the Labour Party to any analysis of these issues. What the Scottish Government has put in place is a range of different measures that support the individuals in our society to live their lives in an effective and well-supported fashion. If you take concessionary bus travel, for example, the Labour Party couldn't even bring themselves to support it in Parliament the other day there. What concessionary travel does is give social mobility to elderly people within our society, enabling them to keep active, to get out and about, to visit friends, to go out to different parts of our country, and to maintain a level of social mobility that would not be the case if they were having to pay for all of that bus travel. It's beneficial for individuals and their well-being as just one particular example. So what the SNP government has done is put in place, in a sustained and sustainable way through our budget choices, the type of services that can be provided by the Scottish Government, and we are determined to make sure that that approach is sustained not just under our term of government under devolution, but that we take that forward as part of the values of an independent country, where people have a clear understanding of the benefits they will have from that society.
But is it sustainable? Mr Salmond was pointing out in his speech of possible future tax increases by a Westminster government if Scotland did not become independent, but surely you will be facing some of these same financial pressures in an independent Scotland. I mean, look at the share of the Scottish national debt, 8% population share, that would be about £120 billion, wouldn't it?
Well, but it's hardly going to be new debt. The country's riddled with debt just now, created by the United Kingdom system. So, of course, there is going to be debt that we will inherit, and we will have to service that debt. But the most important point in all of this is that we've demonstrated that we are able to take a sustainable approach to our public services and our public finances. And the big question that people in Scotland face is whether we want to be locked into a perpetual no-growth agenda where growth is strangled by UK governments, or whether we want to try to expand our economy, generate more employment, ensure there is more tax generated as a consequence of all of that, that we can invest into the provision of public services. Now that choice is only on offer to people under independence, where we can grow the Scottish economy, expand the level of employment in our country, and as a consequence generate more revenues that we can invest in public services. That's the opportunity that a yes vote in the referendum opens up for people in Scotland.
Well, you probably need to borrow to be able to do that, and that's what the Chancellor says he doesn't want to do, because he thinks that's not the right way forward, to borrow more to fund that. And of course, looking at the figures, Scotland is less in deficit than the rest of the UK, but we're still in deficit.
But if you look at the Chancellor's position, he says that he doesn't want to borrow anymore. The Chancellor is borrowing £244 billion more than he expected to borrow when he came to office. So he's borrowing more, yes, but he's borrowing more to invest in failure of an economic policy and economic strategy. Now, what we want to make sure is that we take a responsible approach to the public finances. You're absolutely right in your analysis that Scotland is in deficit, so is the UK, but we're in a relatively stronger financial position, able, if we choose, to invest more in the economy, able, if we choose, to invest in reducing debt faster, able, if we choose, to invest in a long-term oil fund to benefit the country. But the crucial point is those choices only become available to us if we are an independent country and are able to take those decisions on our own behalf in the best interests of the people of Scotland. And that's really the choice that faces people in the referendum. It's either we get locked into an agenda from the UK government which is about dealing with the costs of failure,
right,
or we invest in our country by taking our own decisions.
Mr Swinney, thank you very much for joining us. We'll have to leave it there, I'm afraid. Thank you. So what issues will dominate the debate in the coming months? Well, our political correspondent Raymond Buchanan has been to Stirling to gauge the mood of the voters there.
Stirling Old Bridge. It was by these waters that William Wallace routed the English on an autumn day back in 1297. Today, politics on these islands is far less bloody, more about words than weapons. Autumn 2014 will soon have its own place in Scotland's old story. But before that date, the debate. And that debate will be shaped in large part by the economy. What imprint will independence leave on Scottish people and businesses? This laser printing company in Stirlingshire has many questions before polling day arrives.
Well, I think the main thing is we don't really seem to have enough information about what's going to happen. I mean, I've got a well-established business and a lot of my customers are from the south with trying to establish more business in Scotland, from Scotland, but we don't really know how that's going to change the business in the long term. Is it going to cost us more to trade with the south?
In the shadow of Stirling Castle is the Raploch Estate. It's a place which has seen lots of new investment recently, but it's still home to some of the most deprived households in Scotland. Welfare, pensions and benefits will feature prominently in the independence debate. These three OAPs are concerned what constitutional change might mean for them.
I think he's going to try and change too much too fast. That's my opinion.
I'm the same,
We're the same.
I mean, we're all these pensioners, I mean, so we've did well enough up to now. Why no way? Aye, that's what I'm saying, so why change it now?
It's no accident the referendum is scheduled just a few months before the UK decides whether or not to keep the Tory-led government in power. In Vinnie's bar I found Gordon, Christopher and Tricia. One retired, the other two unemployed, all traditional Labour supporters, turned into backers of independence by UK welfare cuts, particularly the so-called bedroom tax.
I've got 3 bairns in the house, and one of my bairns meant to share with our bairn, so I pay tax for another room. That's not right.
And will the so-called bedroom tax, will that influence whether you vote yes or no in the independence referendum?
Of course it will.
Next year will also see the 700th anniversary of Robert the Bruce's victory over the English. But enough of old battles. The next contest for Scotland's future won't just be about hearts, no matter how brave. It'll be dominated by wallets and purses, pennies and pounds.
So there are 543 days until Scots go to the polls to decide our constitutional future. Shortly before the First Minister made his speech, delegates heard from the SNP's Westminster leader, Angus Robertson, who's also the party's director for the referendum campaign. His theme, the progress that's been made so far.
Millions of pieces of printed materials have been delivered from Shetland to Stranraer, from Stornoway to Selkirk. And our membership has grown spectacularly. Yesterday, the SNP reached the amazing total of 25,000. As is noticeable at SNP conferences like this, we have a new generation of extremely talented members, activists and elected members. At last year's spring conference, we were looking forward to the local government elections, where we became the #1 party with most votes and most councillors. The map of the results also shows that the SNP is Scotland's only genuinely national party. I have that with me here. It's quite an interesting map. Have you seen that one before? It's pretty good, isn't it? But it shows actually something that's quite important. In the top left, everything that is yellow is represented by at least one SNP councillor. In all the other boxes, you see the other political parties not represented throughout the whole of the country. So the SNP can genuinely say that it is the only national party of Scotland, and that, I think, is tremendously important in the run-up to the independence referendum campaign. Since the elections last year, the SNP has been working hard to make sure that we're learning the lessons about best campaign practices both at home and abroad, to make sure we're doing the right things between now and referendum day. Activists, you will know this, you've been out and about putting in a lot of efforts. Regular canvassing is a feature throughout the country. This is boosted immeasurably by the incentive scheme, with headquarters now matching contacts. So just remember, every time that you knock on a door or telephone canvass, your effort will be doubled by the party nationally after reaching a 250 targeted award level, which is a tremendous boost. Many of you are out regularly taking part in street stalls with high visibility campaigns in our villages, our towns and our cities. Our elected members, our councillors, our MSPs, our MPs and our MEPs are working with key people and key sectors in our communities. There are individual meetings and sectoral meetings taking place regularly with localised business audiences, with women, with young people, retired people and other groups. For those of you who need more guidance and ideas, there's an excellent updated campaign guide for referendum activity for SNP branches. It is available in the members-only part of the SNP website. It has full updates on different campaigning ideas, exactly the kind of things that many of you have been getting on with, from street work through leafleting, through voter ID, media contacts and the important voter ID incentive scheme. So for those of you who haven't had a look at that, can I strongly urge you to have a look at the website and download that material. We're working continuously to improve materials, support and technology, and many thanks to people who've been sharing innovative and successful practice, so what works well in one part of the country can be shared with elsewhere. We've also been learning lessons from elsewhere, and I'd like to thank my hosts in the United States in the run-up to the presidential elections last year. It's good to know that most of what we are doing here in Scotland is already cutting edge by international standards, and there are further lessons which we are integrating into our campaign, the run-up to the referendum. One example of that is our IT campaign system. It's going through the final stages of a key upgrade which will take us towards the referendum. Rest assured, data already collected through the Activate system, which has been so important to us, will continue to be extremely valuable, as will everything collected in the updated system. One of the biggest challenges of the last year has seen the widening one of the biggest changes, in the last year has seen the widening of our campaign efforts with the formation of Yes Scotland in every local authority area. We're working well nationally and on the ground with colleagues from other parties and volunteers who are not in any party. So to update conference on the work of Yes Scotland, can I ask you to give a very warm welcome to the Chief Executive of Yes Scotland, Blair Jenkins.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Conference, for that warm welcome. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here with you today in this momentous week for the independence movement. So now we know the date. We know that Westminster isn't working. We know that Scotland's future is best in the hands of the Scottish people. We know that an independent Scotland can be a fairer and more prosperous country. We know we can win the argument. We know we can win the referendum in 2014. I'd like to thank all of you, and indeed the SNP members who are not here today, for the tremendous enthusiasm and support you've given to Yes Scotland, in particular for the way you've welcomed and embraced the many people from other political parties and from no political party whom you've now found as your fellow campaigners. As Angus said, lots of campaigning, lots of canvassing, lots of activity right around the country. We now need to step that up a gear. We know what we have to do. We have a mission, we have a deadline, and I'm so glad that we can count on your support. Thank you very much.
Well, we can get more reaction to Alex Salmond's speech from outside the conference hall. Let's head back to Inverness and join Brian.
Thanks very much indeed, Andrew. We heard from Angus Robertson a few minutes ago. I'm joined now by Angus Robertson and a couple of his colleagues. You were putting forward all the efforts you're making to win a yes vote. Given that, why are the polls still stubbornly suggesting that you're behind?
Well, I think the public is beginning to engage now more seriously with what is a very exciting and historic prospect of the referendum next year. Do we become a normal country, able to make decisions for ourselves, or forever allow Westminster to make the really important decisions? I know it's hard to believe for people, journalists or for politicians, to imagine that the public is not talking about this issue or others all the time.
You accept you're behind at the moment?
Well, I think there's a job of work to do, and that's why much of what the First Minister was saying was aimed at an outside audience, and I think striking a really excellent balance between speaking to the country and speaking to the whole, speaking to the converted, speaking to those who need to be converted, and with the message that he has, and with the policies he was talking about, it's very, very strongly aimed at winning over people who are currently undecided to vote yes in the referendum next year.
Let's turn next to Annabel Ewing, or Annabel Goldie, as you were introduced
Yeah, I think Brian Derek Mackay, our business convener, who was chairing that session, is probably in a bit of bother with Miss Goldie when he gets back to the
With both of you, your face was a picture, I have to say. The tone of the First Minister's address, it was quite modulated, statesperson-like. Is that to do with getting over a message beyond the SNP, perhaps particularly to women voters?
Well, I'm not entirely sure I accept the premise of your question, because in the First Minister we have a man who is a supreme communicator, who is able to communicate with everybody in all walks of life, and that is, I guess, one of the main reasons why we are where we are, Brian. But I think what the message I would take from today's speech, if you could condense it to one issue, would be that what the First Minister, Alex Salmond, was trying to say to the people of Scotland was, look, this is where we are now and this is where we could be. And he cited the particular example of childcare, where looking around at other countries, Germany for example, with the same level of tax take, they managed to do so much better with respect to childcare. And I think that's what particularly women in Scotland would like to see us developing. And so I think that was a very important message.
With the economy struggling across the UK as a whole, with the economy struggling in Scotland, set aside the reasons you would argue for that, is it not a period where you're going to hear anxiety and concern on the doorsteps that you need to counter before people will go for independence?
Well, I think another very striking fact given today, Brian, was of course the recent OECD League Table of Economic Wealth, and if Scotland were already independent, we would be sitting at position number 8. So I don't know, are the Andean parties saying in effect that Scotland as Scotland, unlike the positions 1 to 7, would not be able to be an independent country? I have to also add, of course, that the UK would be sitting in that league table at position number 17. So I think that should give some comfort to the people of Scotland, that Scotland as Scotland with control over her own resources would be a very different place than we see today.
Also joined by Kirsty Curry, a first-time speaker, I believe, at that conference. Indeed. What's the pitch to younger voters, do you believe? Is there a distinctive pitch, or is it a comparable message?
No, very much so. I think younger voters really definitely need to be included far more in the discussions than they have been in previous years and previous elections. I'm a former teacher myself, and I speak to a lot of young people a lot of the time, and they weren't interested in the politics of before. What Alex Salmond said in his speech today was, I believe, very inspiring for them. The massive benefits have come through youth employment has been a great improvement for young people in this country, and it can only get better. However, to get better, we would need to be a fully independent, normal country and have controls over our own affairs.
Next, someone who is very definitely not a first-time conference speaker, Dennis Canavan. If it were the House of Commons, Dennis, I'd be shouting "I spy strangers." What on earth are you doing at an SNP conference?
Yes, that was my maiden speech at an SNP conference, and I must say that I enjoyed it. I think I got a very warm reception. I was pleasantly surprised by the warmth of the reception. And I hope that I managed to get an important message across on behalf of the Yes Scotland campaign, because I'm not a member of the SNP, I'm not a member of any party.
Have you ever voted for the SNP at any point? Have you ever voted SNP?
Yes, I have, but I have voted on the merits of the candidate rather than for the party.
But you're not a nationalist, you wouldn't describe yourself?
I'm not a nationalist, no, I prefer to be described as an internationalist, and I made that point in my speech, that I think an independent Scotland would give the people of Scotland the opportunity to build a better future for themselves and their children and their grandchildren, but it would also give us a great opportunity to play our part in helping to build a better world in cooperation, much closer cooperation with the international community than what we get at Westminster.
Do some of your former Labour colleagues say to you, what on earth are you doing in this company?
What on earth am I doing? Well, as I explained during the course of my speech, I was virtually born and brought up in the Labour Party. My granddad was one of the founders of the Labour Party in the county of Fife. But I really do think that a lot of the people who are now involved in the independence movement, they want to continue the struggle of the Labour pioneers who set up the Labour Party at the beginning of the 20th century, that Westminster is not delivering. It's incapable of delivering the social justice agenda which many Labour supporters want to see, and which my granddad wanted to see, and his comrades who set up the Labour Party all these years ago.
Ms Robertson, let's turn back to you. A Westminster issue, welfare benefits. The announcement from the First Minister that an SNP council would not seek to evict anyone. What is that? What's the substance of that? Is that someone who falls into trouble with their rent arrears as a consequence of the under-occupancy allowance?
The SNP Council in Dundee has already laid out an imaginative way to try and deal with some of the effects of the bedroom tax. Of course, we can't get to grips with the policy writ large unless we have the power to do so. So this is exactly the kind of issue that Dennis Canavan is raising about social justice. And that's not just an SNP agenda. There are people out there who voted Labour and voted for other parties who care deeply about this. And that's why we're trying to get over to people with the limited powers of devolution, and in this case it's local government, what our colleagues in local government can deliver. We'll do everything to try and ameliorate with the Tories and Lib Dems, the people we didn't elect, who are in power over Scotland at Westminster. But the only way we can really get to grips with this, really deliver on social justice, things that people in the SNP and people who support Labour care about, is by voting yes in the referendum. So we're trying to build bridges to explain why only independents can make that difference.
But Annabel Ewing, didn't the leak of John Swinney's cabinet papers show privately the SNP cabinet is just as anxious and nervous about the state of Scotland's public finances as your opponents?
No, Brian, I don't believe so. As I said a moment ago, the reality of the situation is that if we look at oil and gas, for example, we look at the massive investment coming in to the North Sea in the years to come. That investment is not being made because there's no oil to come out, that it's not valuable. That investment is a clear signal that this is still a very, very attractive resource. And the point has been made in the Scottish Parliament this week when we debated Scotland's economy. In any other country, having such a fantastic resource as oil and gas would be seen as a blessing. But to the anti-independence parties, somehow it is suddenly a curse. That is nonsense.
The calculation right now, even with a geographical share of oil, Scotland is still in deficit, and that oil is going to go.
Well, it is the case that Scotland has a relative deficit, but relative to the UK, it is in a better position. Most countries in the world at the moment are running a deficit, so that's really not a clincher of an argument.
The UK is not as dependent on oil as Scotland is.
Well, I think it's also fair to say that Norway is much more dependent on oil than an independent Scotland would be, and Norway, I think, is sitting as one of the richest countries in the entire planet. So I think we have to take this debate very seriously, and it's not enough for the anti-independence parties to suggest that somehow having massive oil and gas reserves is a curse. Quite the contrary, it's a blessing.
Christine Curry, how do you counter the concerns that you and your colleagues will hear on the doorsteps that, OK, they maybe like the idea of self-government, maybe like the idea of standing up on their own 2 feet or whatever. They get those messages, they get that concept. But independence is a bigger change than any of that right now at a time of economic uncertainty. Is that not going to be a big challenge?
It's going to be a big challenge, Brian, but it's one that I'm definitely going to relish. I know that my colleagues relish as well. As Dennis Canavan said in his speech earlier on, there's a mountain to climb, but we like climbing mountains. I'm really looking forward to...
You've nicked his best line. Shameless plagiarism.
I think the main thing that we're going to have to get through to people on the doorstep is a choice between two paths. It's a choice of either becoming an independent country where we might not know every single answer that's going to happen, or the status quo, and I know what I would go for.
That is, your erstwhile Labour colleagues would say that you need the bigger polity, the bigger political setup of the UK to allow fairness to be shared more evenly across that number of citizens, that you can only do it with a large number of citizens, that you can share welfare, you can share resources more equally, that it's far harder in the smaller economy of Scotland.
I used to think that way. I used to imagine that the return of a Labour government at Westminster would be the best vehicle for delivering the social and economic improvements that I want to see. But we've had various governments now in my lifetime and in your lifetime. We've seen Labour governments come and go. We saw New Labour, we saw the Blair government. I mean, for heaven's sake, getting involved in illegal wars, retaining nuclear weapons, the whole economy ending up in a complete mess. And now we've got a coalition government, which the people of Scotland did not vote for. And the only way in which the people of Scotland can be guaranteed to get the type of government they vote for is through independence, and that will mean about bringing the necessary changes, the improvements in things like getting rid of this iniquitous bedroom tax, like better education opportunities for our children, a free national health service, getting rid of nuclear weapons. These are the things that the Labour Party used to stand for. I still stand for these things, and a lot of people in the independence movement still stand for these things.
Angus Robertson, when might we see a movement in the polls, if you are right and these messages are starting to get through?
Well, we're working on the ground already, and we're trying to make sure we get the balance right between efforts in communities, touching every household, touching families, touching communities, but also the different sectors of society, so our various interests. And that's what I think was reflected in the First Minister's speech. He made sure he was addressing all of Scotland to try and get the point over that there's something in this for everybody. We're in this together. We all live here, we all care about here, and what we need to do is get people to understand this is a big choice, it's an exciting choice, it's a historic choice, and I think between now and September 2014, we now know the date, we will work hard. Dennis is right to say it's a mountain to climb, but I think inexorably we will reach that peak and people will decide, you know what, Scotland is no better or no worse than any other country, but we really should get on with being a lot more successful, socially just, and play our part in the world, and we can only do that with a yes vote.
Thanks all four. So already we've had Kirsty nicking a line from Dennis Canavan. We're in this together. Angus nicking a line from the Prime Minister. I don't know. Shameless. Shameless. Back to the studio.
Brian, thank you very much for that. Now, Professor Curtis is still with me here in the studio. John, interesting, Angus Robertson was saying there, a big choice, an historic choice, but right at the top of the interview he said that the SNP or the Yes campaign still had a job of work to do.
Indeed. At the end of that interview he admitted that they had a mountain to climb. What he was trying to suggest, however, though, he wasn't willing to tell us when he thought the polls would move, but he thought at the moment what the polls were getting was the reaction of a public that for the most part is not yet engaged in the issue, and he's anticipating when the public gets more engaged and those people who haven't made up their minds make up their minds that the Yes campaign will narrow the poll lead. Well, that's a reasonable aspiration. I'm not quite sure, however, that his premise is correct. I mean, certainly one indication you would expect to see, if we were talking about a public that wasn't engaged in the issue, that when the pollsters asked them how they were going to vote, a lot of them said, I don't know. And the truth is, at the moment, the polls are saying about 20% of people are saying they don't know. Now, it's not a very small number, but to give you some idea of how that stands against as compared with other things, 6 months before the referendum on the alternative vote for the House of Commons, a subject which indeed very few people had engaged with before Nick Clegg and David Cameron came up with the idea of that referendum, 35% of people said they didn't know. Even in polls 2 months before polling day, still 30% of people said they didn't know. Now, as compared with that, this looks like an issue about which many people in Scotland have formed a view, and therefore it may be rather difficult to turn. And it's also worth bearing in mind, other polling evidence says that, beyond that 1/5 of people who haven't made their minds up, there's perhaps only another 1/5 of people who are willing to change their minds. The Yes campaign are going to get all of these folk onto their side if they are indeed going to succeed in getting to the top of that mountain.
John, thanks very much. Now, let's cross for a final time back to Brian in Inverness. He's joined by some members of the Fourth Estate.
Absolutely. Two leading members of the Fourth Estate, two fellow journalistic colleagues, Campbell Gunn, Tom Gordon. Thanks both very much indeed. Let's deal with this announcement on the bedroom tax, the so-called bedroom tax, first of all. Campbell, what do you make of that, the substance of it perhaps?
Well, he's trying to point out that this is the one thing that they can do with the limited powers, as he sees it, that they have. Dundee Council has already said they won't evict anyone, and he's now said that any SNP-led council will follow suit. But it's not everybody.
It's not everybody. If somebody's refusing to pay the rent, they're going to get kicked out, aren't they?
Exactly. It's a very marginal announcement, I believe. It's not a major announcement.
But it's perhaps, what would you say, philosophically significant, Tom Gordon? What do you reckon?
Symbolic, for sure. I mean, the whole theme of the speech was to paint two very different futures. It's a fairly grim future under Westminster rule, and a far more sunny future, potentially, under independence. And he was illustrating that with the bedroom tax, this fairly obnoxious social policy that the coalition are imposing on Scotland, and saying, look, we can do a little to ameliorate it, but if we had our own independent country, we could abolish it possibly.
And of course he linked it directly with the poll tax, didn't he? Again, no mistake there, wasn't
there? Yeah, again, it's this theme that Scotland right now is a country where things are done to it, And the SNP are saying with independence, it could be a country where things are done for and by the people rather than to them.
Campbell, how about the tone of the First Minister's speech?
It was very much a change of tone. It was quite low key, I think, for a major address by Mr. Salmond. It was pretty low key, but he was moving from the how of independence. We've now got the referendum bill. We've now got the date. He's moved on to the why of independence. He's saying we can make Scotland a better place. And he's obviously the bedroom tax thing was pointing to, well, we wouldn't have done this, and this is what we'll do to ameliorate it if we can.
Yeah. I mean, Tom, usually when the First Minister is ordering a fish supper, it's Ciceronian oratory that we see. On this occasion, it was much more conversational.
There's certainly plenty of welly, usually. I mean, he only really stepped on the gas at a couple of moments. I think Campbell's dead right. He's trying to sort of downplay that, make this more methodical, logical. He knows he's in a campaign where he has to win over converts. He can't just talk to the converted already and rouse them up. He has to sort of appeal directly to folk who are not natural SNP supporters and bring them over. And he'll try and do that in a sort of calm, conversational, logical way. And I think we saw a lot of that today.
Strangely, the rousing bit was done by Dennis Canavan, actually.
Right. Stole his thunder.
Yes, well, not so much stole his thunder. I think it allowed him to sort of say, I am not an SNP supporter, but I support independence, and which went down really well with the delegates.
How about the economic arguments? That's still a hard sell when the economy is in difficulty, and you have Mr. Salmond's opponents saying it is far better to address these economic concerns across that wider economy of the UK.
Yes, but I think we'll see tomorrow Nicola Sturgeon will move on to the economy, and I think she'll make some announcements on the economy trying to point out that Scotland would be much better off independent.
So, Tom Gordon, that economic point, how does he tackle that? How does he address that?
Well, he's obviously reviving the Scotland's oil theme that's served them well through the decades. They're putting a lot of emphasis on that. But it's difficult because he's also talking about a currency union. A currency union would constrain Scotland's options in future. Yes. They're always talking about economic levers, but they can only pull them so far inside a currency union.
And this is self-created, isn't it? Because they want that currency union, they want those constraints to be there.
They're stitching their own straitjacket in that.
Are they damaged by the leak of the John Swinney cabinet memo suggesting, admittedly perhaps around a year ago, volatility in oil meant there had to be constraint in spending?
I think that realism was a useful injection into the campaign. What would be really alarming in a government if it was all just sort of like, rainbows and songbirds and stuff, and they never saw the dark side, or the potential dark side of the future. But there's a realism there, and I think that's useful in the long run.
I think we were quite happy to get that information out there, actually, especially this early in the campaign, and inject some realism into it.
Into what the prospects for Scotland. Yes. But doesn't it leave them looking like saying one thing in public and one thing in private? Well, are you open to that?
It did, of course it did. But I think he wanted that information out there. They're trying not to say it'll all be sweetness and light and honey. And
where do you think are the major attack points upon the SNP, Tom? The major weak points or attack points for the opponents? Is it defence, perhaps, particularly?
I don't think defence so much, because they'll always just turn around and say, oh well, defence means Trident, no one wants Trident, the majority of people in Scotland don't want Trident. It's going to be the economy, it's going to be what happens to your pension on day one, who's going to pay that, do your national insurance contributions transfer over.
And Mr. Swinney's paper said that pensions had to be under review. He stressed that, didn't stress later that it didn't mean abolition of the state pension, but he did say review.
Well, one of the first things, supposing there is a yes vote, one of the first things of independence would be an emergency budget, and they would have to look in detail about all these spending areas. Maybe the more childcare, or does something get cut to pay for that? There are a huge variety of spending decisions to make.
I think the currency is a weak point for him. I think there's even a majority, well, not a majority, but a fair number of SNP supporters aren't happy with the currency union with the rest of the UK.
Thanks both very much indeed. Rainbows and flowers from Tom Gordon. Personally speaking, I like rainbows and flowers, especially if the colour tangerine is very prominent. Back to the studio.
Ryan, thank you very much to you and the team in Inverness. And that brings our live TV coverage of the conference to a close. My thanks to Professor John Curtis for his company here this afternoon. Do join me tomorrow for Sunday Politics Scotland at 11:35, when we'll have more from the conference, and I'll be speaking live to the First Minister, Alex Salmond. So, from the team here in the studio, and also from the team up in Inverness, thanks very much for your company this afternoon. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye for now.